Hello, and welcome to the Happy Horse Nutrition Podcast. I'm Dr. Nerida, professional equine nutritionist, horse lover, and the human behind the My Happy Horse Nutrition app. And today, we're diving into one of those three-letter acronyms that pops up all over feed bags, hay analysis reports, and Facebook arguments. NSC. What even is it? Is it always bad? Should you be checking it, testing it, feeding for it, or freaking out about it? Here's the thing. NSC stands for Non-Structural Carbohydrates. And while that might sound like something from your high school chemistry nightmares, it's actually one of the most important parts of horse nutrition to understand if you've got a horse with metabolic issues, laminitis risk, or even just a sensitive gut. And something we don't often talk about is it is really important to understand NSC when you are feeding metabolically healthy performance horses too. So in this episode, I'm going to break down exactly what NSC is, where it shows up in your horse's diet, and crucially, when it is too high or too low and becomes a problem. We'll chat starch, sugars, timing of grazing, the great ESC versus WSC debate, and why the same paddock can be safe at 6 a.m. and a metabolic disaster a few hours later. Whether you're feeding a high-performance athlete, a kid's pony, or an insulin-dysregulated laminitic, this is one of those episodes that will hopefully help you feel and feed smarter, sleep better, and maybe even correctly answer the next pasture-based question at a pub trivia night. Actually, I'm probably promising too much there. I'm useless at pub trivia and they never ask those types of questions. So let's just focus on helping you understand NSC so it's not as confusing as heck when you next come across it in your horse feeding travels. Let's get into it. So as I've already mentioned, NSC just stands for Non-Structural Carbohydrate. And non-structural carbohydrates are the sum of starch and water-soluble carbohydrates in your horse's feed. So I'm going to hit you with another three-letter acronym, and that is WSC, and that's the water-soluble carbohydrate of NSC. Sorry, there is a lot of acronyms in this non-structural carbohydrate conversation. So let me repeat that. So NSC is non-structural carbohydrate. And non-structural carbohydrate is the sum of starch plus water-soluble carbohydrates, and the water-soluble carbohydrate often gets abbreviated to WSC on your hay analysis reports, on your feed bag labels and things like that. So I just want to explain that so you understand when you see WSC, you know what that is. And then to dig down one level, the water-soluble carbohydrates are made up of sugars. So the sugars are things like glucose, which are all familiar with, fructose and sucrose. And sucrose is like table sugar, the sugar that you would put if you still put it in your tea and coffee, or the sugar that you find in soft drinks, or, buy in bags from the supermarket. That's sucrose. So water-soluble carbohydrate is those sugars plus fructans. I know it's a lot of terminology and I'm really sorry. I will try and simplify it down as much as I can, but it's important to understand all of these different components of non-structural carbohydrate. So again, non-structural carbohydrate is starch plus water-soluble carbohydrates, and the water-soluble carbohydrates are sugars like glucose, fructose and sucrose, and fructans. So there's a few parts to it, and as this episode goes on, we'll dig into it more and more, what these different parts of NSC are and also how they affect your horses. So let's first, though, talk about where you would find non-structural carbohydrates in your horse's feed. So you find NSC in hay and pasture and feeds. So it shows up pretty much everywhere that you've got plant-based ingredients in your horse's diet. And the reason that is non-structural carbohydrates are actually created by plants during the process of photosynthesis as their own food. And it is something that I love about plants, is that they make their own food. Like, imagine if we could just go and stand outside in the sun and drink some water and breathe some air and create our own carbohydrate. Would make life rather boring because there'd be no reason to go and eat yummy food. But it really is kind of freaky when you think about it, that plants just have to sit out in the sun with their green leaves and go through a process of photosynthesis where they take the carbon dioxide from the air and water from the soil, and they use sunlight as energy, and they turn that carbon dioxide and water into carbohydrate. It's amazing. It freaks me out every time I think about it. But so non-structural carbohydrates are the products of that photosynthesis, and depending on the plant, they'll produce, and also depending on their stage of maturity, they'll produce the starch or the simple sugars like the glucose and the fructose and the sucrose, or they'll produce fructans. You can readily analyse non-structural carbohydrate in your horse's feed. So in a couple of episodes back on the Happy Horse Nutrition podcast, we talk about hay analysis or forage analysis, and I talk in detail there with the crew from Feed Central about non-structural carbohydrates and sending your pasture and hay off for analysis with them. If you're in North America, you've got the amazing Equianalytical you can send your forages to, and there is labs all over the world that will actually do this analysis. But you can test any feed and any forage really and determine the non-structural carbohydrate content of your whatever the ingredient is that you're interested in knowing what the level of the non-structural carbohydrate is. But the thing with non-structural carbohydrates, and the reason why I think there is so much confusion around non-structural carbohydrate and why we're constantly testing for this component in our horses' forages and feeds, is that it's a plant-created carbohydrate or group of carbohydrates, and there are so many factors that will affect how much of this carbohydrate a plant will have on board when it's harvested to be fed to our horses, or when the horse harvests it for itself through grazing and eats it. So it's not a component of feed that ever stays static. So, you could buy exactly the same type of hay from exactly the same farm every year, and it will vary in non-structural carbohydrate level because there are so many different factors that affect the non-structural carbohydrate that a plant will actually create. So I just want to chat for a moment about some of the factors that will affect the level of non-structural carbohydrate that you might find in your horse's hay or pasture. I'll talk less about feeds, but I will talk a little bit about feeds as well. But I'm mostly, in my mind, focused on the forages in this conversation because they're the things that will vary a lot, and they're often the feed ingredients we use for our horses that we don't have a value on. So often we can go to a feed bag and we can see the non-structural carbohydrate level that's been calculated for that feed. But with hays and pastures, and particularly pastures, it's really difficult to know what the non-structural carbohydrate level is on a day-to-day and even hour-by-hour basis. So the first factor that will affect the non-structural carbohydrate level in forages is the plant type. And if we start at whether a plant is a warm season plant or a cool season plant, there's lots of different ways we describe this. So they could be temperate or subtropical, or we also call them C3 plants versus C4. And it just refers to the type of metabolism that a plant has. So I'll use cool and warm season grasses because I feel like that's the best description of these plants, because often, or nearly always, the cool season grasses and legumes will grow in cool seasons, and then the warm season ones will grow in the warm seasons. So you'll often see them in the autumn or fall and winter versus the springs and summers. You tend to see the cool season ones in the cool seasons and the warm season ones in the warm seasons, which makes a lot of sense. And I'm probably just explaining something that's really obvious. Apologies for that. So the cool season grasses have got a very different metabolism to the warm season grasses. And actually, let me talk about the warm season grasses first. So the warm season grasses will tend to accumulate starches and some water-soluble carbohydrates, but less fructan than what the cool season grasses will accumulate. And the warm season grasses are interesting because they have a predetermined storage limit, if you like, for these non-structural carbohydrates. So I like to think about it as, if you think about when you fly on most airlines, they'll give you a baggage allowance. So, you might have 7 kilos of carry-on baggage and then 20 or 22 kilos of check-in baggage. That's your baggage allowance. That's a little bit like a warm season grass has a storage allowance. So they have a certain amount of space in their in their structures, their leaves and their stems, that they're allowed to put these non-structural carbohydrates. Once they fill up that storage space, the storage space is gone, and they're not able to store more than that storage space allows. Versus the cool season grasses, that they're like an airline that just says, you know what, bring as much stuff as you like, which happens never in real life, but they don't have a limitation in where they can store their non-structural carbohydrate. So they will create non-structural carbohydrate and stick it wherever they can find space to put it, which means that the cool season plants will accumulate a lot more non-structural carbohydrate than the warm season plants. So if we think about a comparison between, let's say, Rhodes grass hay, which is going to be a very familiar hay for those of us in Australia, it's a warm season grass, and ryegrass hay. The Rhodes grass hay is a warm season grass, and you'll very rarely see it go above around 12% non-structural carbohydrate, and very often it's a lot lower than that. The ryegrass is a cool season grass, and it will put non-structural carbohydrate wherever it can fit it. And there are published levels of 30% plus non-structural carbohydrate. And I have personally measured ryegrass pastures and ryegrass hays that are 30 to 35% non-structural carbohydrate. So they really do create a lot of food for themselves, and they will store it wherever they can put it, which means they can accumulate really high amounts. So that's probably the biggest factor that affects the non-structural carbohydrate level of a forage. There's also differences between legumes and grasses, and there's also differences within legumes. So we find that clover will accumulate more starch than something like lucerne or alfalfa. So you do have to be aware that between forages, and particularly if you're someone who's looking for low non-structural carbohydrate hays or wanting to plant low non-structural carbohydrate pastures, there's lots of differences between plant species, and it's something that you do need to look into carefully as you are choosing the species of hay you're buying, or choosing the species of pasture plants that you'll be planting. The next biggest factor, I think, in determining, or the next biggest factor I see in determining the non-structural carbohydrate level, is the time of day. Remembering that plants create non-structural carbohydrates when they are sitting out in the sun. Now I have an image of a plant in a yoga pose holding its hands out in the sunlight. That's how my brain works. But you have plants sitting out in the sun, and they're photosynthesizing during the day, creating themselves carbohydrate that they can literally eat later to fuel growth. So over the course of the sunlight hours of the day, you will get plants increasing the level of non-structural carbohydrate that they have stored in their leaves. And then when the sun goes down, the process of photosynthesis, and therefore the process of non-structural carbohydrate production, stops. And the plant will start to eat the food that is accumulated during the day overnight, so that it can continue to stay alive and to grow during the darkness hours. And then when the sun comes up the next day, it'll start producing more carbohydrate again. So plants tend to be lowest in non-structural carbohydrate first thing in the morning, and highest in non-structural carbohydrate last thing in the afternoon. So if we're thinking about cutting hay for laminitic horses, for example, best time to cut it is first thing in the morning, because that's when you'll have the lowest level of non-structural carbohydrate. Often when hay producers are making hay for, say, dairy cattle, they're wanting to cut it last thing in the afternoon, because they want the really high non-structural carbohydrate level, because that is what fuels fermentation in the dairy cow's rumen, and they love that. But it's not ideal for horses to have those really high levels of non-structural carbohydrate. I'll talk, though, a little bit later in this podcast about what the level you want to be aiming for your horse is. So some horses need low non-structural carbohydrate levels. Other horses, and particularly performance horses, you actually want some non-structural carbohydrate in your horse's forages. Not enough will cause problems, but you can also push it too far and cause different problems, and I'll cover all of that soon. So the time of day, which we're talking about, makes a huge difference with the level of non-structural carbohydrate you will see in a forage. I had a situation, must have been 10 years ago. I must go and look up in my records, but it must have been about 10 years ago. I had 3 horses at the time, and all 3 of them got laminitis in the space of a week. And I'm a professional equine nutritionist. I should know how to not let this happen. And yet I had 3 horses that all had laminitis. And I was thinking, what on earth is going on? It was summer. So it completely caught me by surprise. I wasn't expecting the grasses to be a problem for a start. And I didn't know that 2 out of the 3 of my horses were even prone to laminitis. But what I did was go and take a sample because I wanted to know what was going on in my grasses. So I went and took a sample of my pasture right when the sun was coming up in the morning. So it should have been the lowest non-structural carbohydrate level in that 24-hour period. And then on exactly the same day, I went and took a sample of exactly the same pasture from exactly the same part of my paddock as the sun was going down in the evening. It was January, so it was still really long days for us in the Southern Hemisphere. And what I found was that first thing in the morning, my pastures were testing at 8% non-structural carbohydrate. Last thing in the afternoon, they were testing at 20% non-structural carbohydrate. So they'd increased by 12% over about a 14-hour period of sunlight hours. It blew my mind realizing how much those pastures were changing just in that from morning to evening. And the reason my pastures were doing that, or the reason I put it down to, I was like, why are they doing this? It was summertime, and often we think about plants accumulating those large levels of carbohydrate when it's quite cold because they'll photosynthesize, but they won't actually be growing. But that wasn't the case in January. I mean, it was warm, if not hot, and yet they were still accumulating these really high levels of carbohydrate. But what I discovered, and this brings me to the next thing that will affect non-structural carbohydrate in horses' forages, is that our soil at the time was so sulfur and so phosphorus deficient that the plants were green. They were able to grow to an extent. They could photosynthesize, but they didn't actually have the nutrients they needed to grow. So they were sitting there just making carbohydrate during the day, but they're not really having a whole lot of use for it. So it was accumulating. So your soil nutrition has a big impact on non-structural carbohydrate level. And I just mentioned briefly there too, temperature has a big effect on NSC levels. And you'll see this most often in our change of seasons. So either spring or the autumn or the fall, depending on where you are in the world. What we often, and it usually happens more so in spring, is that you'll get these cold nights and often below freezing still coming out of winter, but the day length is getting quite long. So the plants are able to photosynthesize. They can sit there and go through the chemical process of turning the carbon dioxide and the water into carbohydrate. But because it's so cold, they don't grow. They just kind of are in a state of kind of frozen. So they're not actually growing. They're creating carbohydrate, but they're not actually growing. And when that happens, and it happens particularly when you do drop below freezing overnight, but you've got these long, bright, sunny days, the carbohydrate level, because the plant's not using it up overnight, it doesn't really drop very much overnight. So, on day one, let's say, for example, you've got a plant that starts out at 8% non-structural carbohydrate and it might make 2% more during the day. So it's gone up to 10% non-structural carbohydrate during the day, but then it doesn't use any of that overnight. So the next morning it starts at 10 and it creates another 2%, and then we're at 12. And again, because it drops below freezing that night as well, you start the next morning at 12%, and it just goes on and on. It just keeps edging up and up and up. And if you get a run of 5 to 7 days of these freezing nights and bright sunny days, you can end up with non-structural carbohydrates well in excess of 20% and sometimes in excess of 30%. I distinctly remember, because it was so freezing when we were out walking this oat pasture, sampling it late one afternoon in winter in the Hunter Valley. And when the analysis came back for that particular oat pasture, it tested at 35% non-structural carbohydrate. And it was because I think we'd had these bright sunny days and then lots and lots of freezing nights, and the days were still really cold as well. So the plants were creating the non-structural carbohydrate and they weren't using it, so it accumulates. Drought-stressed plants are also prone to accumulating non-structural carbohydrate. So there's lots of reasons why the non-structural carbohydrate will be very different and it can be off the, if you're thinking about hay production, you can have hay cut off the same pasture, exactly the same plant species, but a different time, obviously, because you're cutting, like, let's say, first cut versus second cut out of the same paddock. You can have vastly different non-structural carbohydrate levels because of the environmental conditions that led up to, in the couple of weeks prior to that plant being harvested for hay. So I do think that's a big part of the reason why there's so much chatter about non-structural carbohydrate level, and also why so many of us get caught out, because we'll buy hay and then you buy hay again from the same supplier or from exactly the same place you bought it from last time, and all of a sudden, if you've got, say, a laminitic horse, your horse is not okay, but it can be because the non-structural carbohydrate level can change dramatically in that forage depending on the conditions that plant was grown in. There is lots to understand about non-structural carbohydrate. There's also lots to think about around, do we use non-structural carbohydrate as starch plus water-soluble carbohydrates, or do we use non-structural carbohydrate as starch plus ethanol-soluble carbohydrate, which is abbreviated to ESC, and you will often see ESC on feed bag labels, and you will also see it on your hay or pasture analysis data. And ESC is just the simple sugars, so just the sugars like the glucose and the sucrose and the fructose. It leaves out fructan. So this is important to understand, because if you take, and something I really love to do when I see these carbohydrate analyses is I'll take the water-soluble carbohydrate, which is the simple sugars plus fructan, and I'll minus the ethanol-soluble carbohydrate. So I take away just the simple sugars, and that gives me an indication of how much fructan is in that forage. And the reason that is important is because the fructan is not digestible in the small intestine. So your simple sugars, and part of the reason why we need to pay attention to non-structural carbohydrate is because these simple sugars will be absorbed from the small intestine, they'll enter the blood as glucose, and then that glucose will trigger an insulin response. So for horses that are insulin dysregulated, so horses that are prone to laminitis or horses with PPID, which used to be called Cushing's disease, they have a condition called insulin dysregulation, which means when glucose goes into their blood, they have an insulin response that is way over and above what a normal insulin response is. And really cool researchers in Australia years ago now, but they figured out that it was actually that insulin circulating around a insulin dysregulated horse's body that then triggers laminitis. So we need to be really conscious in these metabolic horses that we're not feeding forages or feeds that are too high in NSC, because it's those simple sugars that trigger the insulin response that then does the damage to their feet and causes laminitis. But the other component of WSC, fructan, is not digestible in the small intestine. So there is a school of thought that says that we can ignore it because it's not actually causing any problems with insulin dysregulation. It's not contributing to the glucose response in the blood, and therefore it's not contributing to these, crazy insulin responses that these insulin dysregulated horses have. So we can ignore it. But my approach to this is that, one, we don't know enough to say that we can ignore it. And the really important thing to remember with fructan is that it is highly fermentable. So if it gets into your horse's hindgut, which it will, because there's nowhere else for it to go. Once it goes undigested through the small intestine, it has to go into the hindgut. And when it ends up in the hindgut, it behaves like starch. So it's highly fermentable, and it will feed the bad bacteria. So the amylolytic party animal bacteria, I keep calling them. I love Dr. Belinda's description for them too, the weedy, greedy creatures. It'll feed them. They rapidly produce acids, they rapidly build up their population, and your horse will end up in a state of microbial dysbiosis, and they will have a hindgut that is more acidic than it should be, and their beneficial fibre fermenting microbes will start to die off. So I always look at water-soluble carbohydrate as opposed to just ethanol-soluble carbohydrate. Did I say that right? Ethanol-soluble carbohydrate. Because if we just look at the ESC, we're missing that fructan component, and we're missing the bit that tells us how that non-structural carbohydrate is going to affect the microbes in our horse's hindgut. And that's really important. I'll talk a lot more about that. Super important when we're talking about performance horses. But even for just staying with this, do we use WSC or do we use ESC to calculate non-structural carbohydrate? The other thing that doesn't let me use ESC is that we don't know the impact of changing even slightly the microbiome on a horse's insulin response. So there is evidence in other species that if you change the microbiome, you'll also change an animal's insulin response. So what I worry about is that if we're ignoring the fructan, we're ignoring the impact on your horse's hindgut. And then we might be causing a dysbiosis if we're unknowingly feeding a feed because we've ignored the fructan component, unknowingly feeding a forage that is feeding the bad bacteria, negatively affecting the good bacteria, and then potentially changing that horse's insulin response and therefore making them more prone to laminitis through insulin dysregulation than what they would otherwise have been. So for me personally, I always use starch plus WSC. So starch plus the water-soluble carbohydrates, which is the simple sugars plus the fructans, as opposed to starch plus ESC, with ESC just being those simple sugars. I hope that makes sense. It was important to explain that fructan component and the impact on the hindgut because it leads into the next bit of this conversation, which is what is a safe level of non-structural carbohydrate for horses. So you can have problems when non-structural carbohydrate is too high, and you can also have problems when non-structural carbohydrate level is too low. So let's look at the problems we can see when we get non-structural carbohydrate level too high. I was having a little bit of a funny, not funny giggle to myself, and I was just sketching out this podcast thinking, gosh, I've got stories to share on nearly all of the problems when non-structural carbohydrate is too high, just from my own horses. So this is a very real thing in horse nutrition. It's something that as a horse owner, I'm constantly aware of. I know at this time of year, so, end of summer and looking at, heading into autumn in the Southern Hemisphere, it starts to become front of mind for me because I know we're going to start heading into cooler weather, and I know that cooler weather typically means that we'll get more cool season pasture growth, and therefore we'll get more non-structural carbohydrate in our pastures. And a couple of my horses are very prone to laminitis, and I have to manage them really carefully for it. And another one of them is quite prone to colic. So, it's something that is front of mind for me. And, bless my horses, they've nearly all provided me with examples I can give you as we go through these problems. But the first one, thankfully, I don't have any personal experience with. So the first problem is that you can get issues with tooth decay. So researchers over in Western Australia actually found that horses that were eating just oat and hay actually had quite severe tooth decay. And when they took these horses and put them on much lower non-structural carbohydrate, less sugar in the hays, their tooth decay over long periods of time, like can take years, would improve again. But the sugars are actually fermented by bacteria in the mouth, and then the bacteria produce acid, and that wears away the enamel. I'm not in any way trained in equine dentistry or anything to do with their teeth, so excuse me if I'm not using the right terminology there. But the thing to remember is if you feed your horse high non-structural carbohydrate hay consistently, and that's the only type of hay they have access to, they are at higher risk of tooth decay. And then if their teeth decay too much, they're at risk of breaking and having all sorts of I think it's periodontal disease and other things that can happen in their mouth, which then causes lots of issues for nutrition because they're not going to be able to chew their feed properly, and it's painful as well. So do be conscious of that if you have access to hays, predominantly have access to hays that are typically high in non-structural carbohydrates. So things like your cereal hays, your oaten and your barley, particularly in cooler areas where barley is harvested earlier, it tends to be higher in non-structural carbohydrate, the barley hay. So do be really conscious of that and conscious of the effect that those hays can have on your horse's teeth. The next issue is insulin responses. So I've told you the story already of with the week that all of my horses got laminitis and their pasture was going from 8% non-structural carbohydrate in the morning up to 20% non-structural carbohydrate in the afternoon. So what research tells us is that at a level of 10% non-structural carbohydrate, we tend to be able to keep a lid on insulin response in most horses. So there is, Dr. Pat Harris has recently presented data showing that a horse with insulin dysregulation on a 9% non-structural carbohydrate hay was still getting a high insulin response, at which point I almost put my head in my hands and started to cry because I was thinking, gosh, it's hard enough to find hay that's, less than 10%. And we sort of think, that most horses are okay at that level. And yet, they're showing really clearly in this horse that even 9% was too high. So it's a little bit of a case-by-case basis for horses and what level is safe when they're really sensitive to non-structural carbohydrate. But less than 10% non-structural carbohydrate is generally considered to be safe for horses that are insulin dysregulated, so horses with metabolic syndrome or horses with PPID, things like that. And then above 10%, you start to creep into unsafe zones, and certainly above 12%, you are more than likely going to trigger laminitis because that forage or that feed will trigger an elevated insulin response, and then that insulin will go to the feet and cause the damage there and cause the painful condition of laminitis. Gastric colic is something that you will see when foragers, and mainly foragers, get too high in non-structural carbohydrate. And this is because the fructan, like I said before, ferments rapidly in your horse's hindgut. So if you're feeding a high non-structural carbohydrate forage, and the difference between water-soluble carbohydrate and ethanol-soluble carbohydrate is quite high, it indicates that there's a lot of fructan in that forage, and then that fructan will go into your horse's hindgut. It will ferment rapidly and create a lot of acids, but it also creates a lot of gas, and you can get a gastric colic from that. And my poet, who is 22 now, gosh, makes me feel old. He used to be on a pasture that had very limited diversity, plant diversity. So it was a majority Queensland bluegrass. And then in springtime, we get all these oats coming through. So they'd have the Queensland bluegrass pretty much all winter. And then in springtime, the oats had come through. And almost without fail on that property, he would get multiple bouts of colic in springtime because of the fructan in the oat that was coming through, causing this gastric colic. Now that I've moved and I have got a very, very diverse pasture, there's so many species of plants in my pasture. I'm so, so fortunate to have landed where I have. And he, touch wood, I've said this a couple of times, I keep inviting disaster, but if I touch wood, it's going to be okay. So touching wood while I say this, he hasn't had colic since we've been here. And I'm almost certain it's because with the diverse forages, he will have a much more diverse microbiome. And then when they have a more diverse microbiome, they're at a lot lower risk of colic conditions. So, and we still get ryegrasses and oats here in this pasture in springtime. He still eats all of that, but it's not causing the gastric colic and the dysbiosis. Well, he's not getting the dysbiosis, I guess, from eating one species of plant all winter, and then all of a sudden coming out into spring and getting these high fructan pastures and experiencing, I would assume, a dysbiosis and then the gastric colic, which is the result of what is being fermented in his hindgut rapidly. I think that was a really roundabout, confusing way to tell you that story, but hopefully it landed. Sorry if that got confusing, but essentially he used to get gastric colic all the time, and it was from the high fructan in the oats that he used to eat, but the more diverse pasture and therefore the more diverse microbiome he would have in his hindgut, I assume, has been protective for him because he hasn't had a bout of colic for 5 years now. Hey, quick moment while you're listening. If feeding your horse ever feels like a puzzle that a toddler has been playing with missing or half-chewed pieces, you are exactly who we built My Happy Horse for. The app makes everything clear, simple, and tailored to your horse, so you always know when you're doing the right thing. Check it out at myhappy.horse or find it on the App Store. All right, back we go. the last negative effect of high non-structural carbohydrate that I want to cover is the microbiome dysbiosis. So we've talked about microbiome dysbiosis and, the negative impact of putting too much non-structural carbohydrate into the hindgut. So it could be in the form of starch that hasn't been digested in the small intestine from grains like raw corn or raw barley. So, if you're feeding cracked or sliced or crushed corn or barley, a lot of that starch that those grains contain end up in the hindgut and they'll ferment rapidly and cause dysbiosis. But what I've also suspected for many years, and what our beautiful off-the-track thoroughbred Alay has demonstrated to us so beautifully in the last 12 months, is that the high fructan content of spring pastures or of any pasture and any forage really, but a high fructan content in a forage will also lead to a dysbiosis. And what we saw with Alay, so we took Alay off the track just over 12 months ago, and I tracked her microbiome from day one, so the day that we got her, right through to the 10-month mark. And what we saw was that her microbiome increased in species diversity. So she started off with around 250 microbial species in her gut. And after 5 months, just with changes in her diet and having access to our beautiful varied pasture, her species increased to 333. And I thought, amazing. She needed more species in her hindgut, and the changes that we put into place in her diet with the sole purpose of increasing the diversity in her hindgut had worked really well. So for reference, a normal horse's hindgut has around 360 different microbial species. So she went from 250 something up to 333. The really interesting thing was, come springtime, and spring for us in 2025 was interesting. So we had lots and lots of below freezing nights and then bright sunny days. And it was interesting because a lot of the hay that got harvested in this area around that time was really high in non-structural carbohydrate. I am absolutely kicking myself that I didn't take a sample of the pasture that Alay was eating at the time I took her fecal sample to do the microbiome analysis. But it was ryegrass predominantly, and watching her graze, and I watch my horses graze a lot because I like to know what species they're eating. So watching her graze, she was selecting out this ryegrass because it was sweet, and horses love sweet, and they will often choose, and in fact not often, I think if you gave your horses a choice between two different grass forages and one had more non-structural carbohydrate than the other, they would choose the sweeter one. They would choose the higher non-structural carbohydrate forage. So she was going around and selecting this very sweet ryegrass pasture. And what we saw in her microbiome was that she actually dropped in species number from 333 at 5 months back down to 319 in springtime, when the non-structural carbohydrate level in her pasture would have been high. And kicking myself a second time that I didn't test the pH of Alay's hindgut or of Alay's manure, the manure sample that I took to do the microbiome analysis. But I distinctly remember, because the smell of manure can tell you so much. So, if I'm in a racing stable and I can smell acid, if the manure smells a little bit like vomit, that those horses are fermenting a lot of grain in their hindgut because they're getting this acid accumulation. But I could smell her manure, and I remember thinking, gosh, that smells acidic. And then the microbiome analysis came back and I went, bingo. So she was fermenting a lot of fructan in her hindgut from that ryegrass. And ryegrass is one of these cool season grasses that will produce fructan as one of their major storage carbohydrates, and then they're allowed to stick it anywhere. So there's no baggage allowance for ryegrass. They're allowed to keep as much non-structural carbohydrate on board as they can fit. So these high non-structural carbohydrate forages can definitely induce a state of microbiome dysbiosis. And that's another reason why I always want to see non-structural carbohydrate as starch plus water-soluble carbohydrate, because it means we capture that fructan component and we're able to make some predictions about how the non-structural carbohydrate in that forage is going to impact your horse's microbiome. Now, the problem with non-structural carbohydrate being too low, and a lot of you will be going, what do you mean too low? Because if you've got a laminitic horse, I get it. The lower the better, and we're always tasting this really low non-structural carbohydrate content hay. But if you've got performance horses, and particularly if you've got race horses where you're wanting them to eat as much energy or as many calories as they can in their day-to-day activities, and particularly getting as much calorie into them as you can in their forages, we don't want hays that are too low in non-structural carbohydrate, because the lower the non-structural carbohydrate in the forage, also the lower their energy. And in the reverse, and in fact this is a problem I'll add in, a late entry to the problems when non-structural carbohydrate is too high. High non-structural carbohydrate forage is also really high in energy or really high in calories. So if you're trying to feed horses and weight is an issue, so too much weight, they're too heavy in condition, then that high non-structural carbohydrate forage will be high in energy, whereas your really low non-structural carbohydrate forages are very low in energy, but they're still really bulky. So the low non-structural carbohydrate forages are perfect when you've got horses that you are trying to control the weight of, and they're nowhere near ideal for performance horses when you're trying to get a lot of energy into them, and you would like a fair proportion of that energy coming in from their forages. And then the other problem, and again for performance horses, is when forages are really low in non-structural carbohydrate, they're also not very palatable. So when you've got horses that are under pressure in work, often in a stabled environment, you want their forages to be as palatable as possible. One, because we just need them to eat the forage so that they're getting their energy into them that is contained in those forages, and that they're eating enough forage. They're eating their minimum of 1.5% of body weight in hay per day. And sometimes I'll hear trainers say, well, I give them grass hay but they won't eat it, or I give them oat and hay but they won't eat it. And if we did an analysis on those forages that the horses are not eating, there's two possibilities. Either it'll be really high in nitrate, but we're not talking about nitrate in this podcast, but that is one possibility for horses not eating forage, or it'll be really low in non-structural carbohydrate, because it just doesn't taste good, and then they're really not very driven to go and eat it. And also too, if the non-structural carbohydrate level is too low and the hay is unpalatable and the horses are not wanting to chew on it, they put themselves in at high risk of gastric ulceration, because they're not driven to go and constantly chew at that forage source. So the correct amount of non-structural carbohydrate, if you're looking at hay analysis data, or you're testing your pastures, or you're looking at a non-structural carbohydrate level on the back of a bag, the ideal level for your horse depends on what your horse needs. So there let's say for insulin dysregulated horses, so any condition that causes insulin dysregulation, so your metabolic horses or your laminitic horses or your Cushing's or PPID horses, those horses you need to find a forage or feeds that are less than 10% non-structural carbohydrate. Some horses, you'll get them to as low as that and they'll still have laminitis. You'll still be triggering their laminitis. And something that I learnt at the AAEP convention in December 2025 was that if you have got a horse and you think that you've got it on a forage that is low in non-structural carbohydrate, but you're still having issues with laminitis and you can't stabilise them, feed them that hay and then take a blood sample about 2 hours later, 90 minutes to 2 hours later, and check their glucose and insulin levels. And that will tell you, mainly insulin level, but that will tell you whether that hay is still triggering a high insulin response. And if it is, you're going to need to either soak that hay to reduce the non-structural carbohydrate level, or ideally go and find hay that has tested lower than what you already have and feed that. But if you've got a horse that you think you've got your NSC low enough and it's still reacting, then feed the forage that is causing the issue, or the feed if it's a feed, and then take a blood test and just see what that individual horse's insulin is telling you. So that's horses that can't have a lot of NSC. For performance horses, when I look at hay analysis results to help with choosing hay for performance horses, and I'm looking at the NSC, what I'm normally looking for is an NSC between 14 and 16%. I find that, ready, there's a pun coming, I find that's the sweet spot. Make myself laugh. But it is the sweet spot. So they love the taste of hay when it's got about that much non-structural carbohydrate in it. But there's not enough fructan at those levels to then go on and cause noticeable microbial dysbiosis. Now, I don't have data on that. At some point in the future, I will have data on that sort of thing. But this is me very much feeling around with how performance horses do and, looking at parameters like fecal pH and just performance and appetite. That's where I've found if we can get hays for performance horses between that 14 to 16% non-structural carbohydrate, that's about where they do really well. Now, you can definitely feed, if your preference is to feed lower than that, you can definitely feed lower than that. Once you start to go above that, and particularly if you go above 20% non-structural carbohydrate in a forage, I do think you're then starting to edge into that territory where there'll be so much fructan in that forage or starch. It can also be starch that accumulates to quite high levels, but there'll be so much non-structural carbohydrate that you will start to shift the microbiome like Alay showed us, and then you'll potentially start to see other problems that flow on for that. In a couple of weeks, we are recording a podcast with Dr. Belinda where we're going to be talking about Alay's microbiome analyses over the first 10 months of her being with us. It will be a fascinating conversation. I can't wait to pick Dr. Belinda's brains more around it. But if you are interested in that, keep an eye out for that podcast. It will be coming soon, and we'll talk a lot more about these shifts in microbiome that we saw with her. But I do think if you're seeing non-structural carbohydrate levels of more than 20%, you do need to be careful with that. It doesn't mean to say that you can't feed some hay that is higher in non-structural carbohydrate, but make it just a small part of a horse's diet. So I'll give you an example. There's a hay grower in my region. They grow amazing hay. It's got all sorts of different grass species. It's grown specifically for forage variety in horses, and they harvested some in the spring of 2025. So the spring that I said we had lots of cold nights and then bright sunny days. And the hay came back at, I can't remember exactly now, it was like 22 or 24% non-structural carbohydrate. Now, I would still use some of that hay for performance horses, but I would feed no more than, say, 1.5 to 2 kilograms of that hay per day. I know that they would find it really palatable, which is part of the reason why I would still feed some, but I would make sure that it was fed with a hay that was much lower in non-structural carbohydrate, so that when it's averaged out for the horse's total forage intake, you're getting a much lower non-structural carbohydrate content, if that makes sense. So performance horses, 14 to 16%, you can definitely use lower. And if your horse is a metabolic performance horse, so if you've got, a laminitis prone performance horse, don't feed that high. You have to follow the less than 10% non-structural carbohydrate rules for metabolic horses, even if your horse is a performance horse. But I'm thinking specifically for thoroughbred racehorses, standardbred racehorses, horses that got really high energy requirements, and sometimes appetite is an issue. So we want something that is really tastes good for them. So I look at that 14 to 16% non-structural carbohydrate. Okay, that's probably as much as I can decode non-structural carbohydrate for you in one podcast session. Hopefully, I have left you feeling clearer on what non-structural carbohydrate is and what it means for your horse and the levels that you should be looking for, as opposed to more confused. If I was to leave you with one final thought, it would be to remember that we don't need to demonize the sugars and starches in our horse's feed. So don't look at non-structural carbohydrate as being the enemy. Certainly, if you've got metabolic horses, you need to be really conscious of the level and make sure that you keep it low enough to keep your horse safe. I usually say to people with horses that have got laminitis that you can't stabilize, keep digging through your horse's diet, because there will be something in the diet that continues to trigger that horse's insulin response. It might be the forage non-structural carbohydrate, and like I said, great tip from the AAEP convention was to blood test after you feed a particular hay, so 90 minutes to 2 hours after, to check the insulin response that has been created from that hay. if you've got performance horses, non-structural carbohydrates can definitely be your friend. And actually something that I didn't mention previously that I will throw in here because it's important is that the hindgut is such an important source of energy for performance horses. And having that slightly higher non-structural carbohydrate level, I mentioned that it gives the horse more energy, so the higher non-structural carbohydrate forages will be also higher in energy. And some of that energy, when it comes from fructan, does come out of the hindgut. So you will, I guess, upregulate the rate of fermentation in the hindgut when you're putting controlled amounts of fructan into the hindgut. And then it's kind of like turning up the dial on a gas knob, like you're putting more energy out when you're increasing the level of fermentation. But I described it recently to a racing stable. Actually, it was Josh from Kiramar Racing. We were chatting about the hindgut and, and how we want to push the hindgut to its limits to some extent so that we can pump as much energy into these horses as possible. But if we push too far, it's like redlining an engine. So if you push too far, you'll blow the whole system apart. But that 14 to 16% non-structural carbohydrate for your performance horses pushes their hindgut a little bit. So it makes the hindgut pump out a lot more energy into the horse's muscles so that they've got a lot more fuel to do the performance that you want, to fuel the performance that you need from them. But it doesn't push it so far that you redline them. Whereas if you feed them a much higher non-structural carbohydrate forage, then you're getting into that risky territory where you're going to completely unbalance the horse's microbiome and sort of bring everything undone in that horse's gut. We don't need to demonize the non-structural carbohydrate, but knowing the amount that is in your horse's feed or hay or pasture and understanding how that non-structural carbohydrate will affect your specific horse then lets you make smart and much more confident decisions around the amount of non-structural carbohydrate that is actually safe and will support their health and performance. So focus on that as opposed to it being a bad thing in your horse's diet. Now, if this episode has left you thinking, how do I find out the non-structural carbohydrate in my hay? Do I need to worry about colic risk? Should I be feeding more non-structural carbohydrate if I've got a performance horse? We'd be super happy to help. Go and download the My Happy Horse Nutrition app and you will find various ways we can help you in there. And if you found this episode helpful, I'd absolutely love for you to share it with your horsey friends or go to your favourite podcast platform and leave us a quick review and star rating. Thank you so much for being here. Until next time, give your horses a big scratch from me and I'll catch you in the next episode. If you'd like to know more about the My Happy Horse Virtual Equine Nutritionist, you can head on over to myhappy.horse. And also while you're there, check out the Dr. Nerida AI, which is me in AI format. And that version of me is happy to answer your questions about horse nutrition 24/7. Thanks again, and we'll catch you soon.